The Krell Dominion had controlled the outer regions of space for 3,000 years, and their method was simple enough for anyone to understand. They believed that chaos was the best weapon anyone could use against their enemies because when people panicked and turned on each other, the Krell could walk in and take whatever they wanted, without firing a single shot. Their scales shimmered like oil on water, and their 4 eyes could see things that most species missed, but what they couldn't see was that they were about to make the biggest mistake in their long history. Admiral Marcus Kane stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Valiant and stared at the holographic display that showed 17 colonies going dark, one after another like candles being snuffed out by an invisible hand. There were no distress calls and no warnings and no final messages from loved ones saying goodbye. There was just silence, and that silence was somehow worse than any scream could have been because at least a scream meant someone was still alive to make noise. Lieutenant Carla Ross sat at her console with her fingers moving across the controls like a pianist playing a familiar song, but her face showed that the music she was hearing wasn't pleasant at all. She looked up at Marcus with wide eyes and said that they were receiving a transmission from someone who identified themselves as the Krell, and Marcus nodded for her to put it on the main screen, even though he had a feeling he wasn't going to like what he was about to see. The view screen flickered and then showed a creature that looked like it had crawled out of humanity's worst nightmares with reptilian features, and those 4 eyes that seemed to look right through a person to see all their fears and weaknesses. When it spoke, the translator turned its hissing voice into words that everyone could understand. But the cold calculation behind those words needed no translation at all. The Krell on the screen said that humans had spread across stars that didn't belong to them, and that the Krell had decided to do something about it by releasing what they called their gift upon the human colonies. The gift was chaos and discord and madness that made people tear at each other like animals consumed by paranoia and rage. The Krell demanded that humanity surrender, or watch their species devour itself from the inside out, like a snake eating its own tail until there was nothing left but bones and regret. The transmission ended as suddenly as it had begun, and the bridge fell silent except for the quiet hum of the ship's systems that seemed almost too loud in the absence of that horrible hissing voice. Marcus stood there for a long moment with his jaw clenched so tight that his teeth hurt, but he needed that pain to remind himself that this was real, and not some nightmare he would wake up from in his quarters. He turned to Carla and told her to get him a channel to Earth Command immediately, because every second they wasted was another second that people were dying on those colonies. He also told someone to find out exactly what the Krell had done to their people because they needed to know what they were dealing with before they could figure out how to fix it. What the Krell didn't understand and what they couldn't have understood because they had never bothered to really study humanity was that humans had spent their entire existence fighting chaos in one form or another. They had refined it and weaponized it and most importantly learned to thrive in it like fish that had evolved to swim in the deepest and darkest parts of the ocean where nothing else could survive. The Krell thought they were being clever by using chaos as a weapon, but what they had actually done was give Earth's military-industrial complex the one thing it had been quietly hoping for in the decades of relative peace. A legitimate reason to stop holding back and show the galaxy what humanity was really capable of when someone pushed them too far. Down on Earth in a facility that didn't officially exist according to any government records, Director Frank Morrison received the news about the Krell attack and allowed himself a small smile that would have terrified anyone who knew what it meant. He had spent 20 years managing projects that the Ethics Committee always got nervous about and keeping weapon systems locked away because there was no immediate threat that justified using them. He had soldiers who trained for scenarios that everyone hoped would never happen, and scientists who developed things that made even hardened military officers uncomfortable. Now he finally had a reason to open those locked doors and let loose everything that humanity had been keeping in reserve for exactly this kind of situation. In another facility, Dr. Angela Price was already looking at preliminary data from one of the affected colonies, and her eyes widened as she saw the sophistication of the Krell bioweapon. It was designed to spread through the brain's fear centers and amplify every negative emotion while shutting down the parts that made humans rational and civilized. It was elegant in a terrible way, and Angela found herself both horrified and fascinated by how well it worked. Her assistant Kevin Hall asked if she could develop a counteragent, And Angela didn't even look up from her screen as she said she would need 48 hours. But yes, she could do it, because the human brain was already showing signs of adaptation in a small percentage of the infected population. Their neural plasticity was fighting back even without help, and that gave her hope that they could save at least some of the people who had been exposed. Across human space, the military began to mobilize, but not in the way that the Krell would expect, because humanity had learned long ago that the best way to fight an unconventional enemy was with unconventional tactics. Instead of massive fleets charging toward Krell territory like bulls seeing red, there would be smaller units hitting specific targets and disappearing before anyone could respond. Instead of meeting chaos with order, they would meet it with precision, chaos that was carefully controlled and directed like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting out a cancer. Captain Jake Sullivan sat in a bar in New Tokyo drinking whiskey and thinking about his 6 years in the 14th Special Operations Group before he had retired to this quiet life that was slowly driving him insane with boredom. When the sealed orders arrived on his personal comm device, he read them twice to make sure he wasn't imagining things, and then he smiled for the first time in months because finally, there was something worth getting out of bed for. He paid his tab and walked out into the neon-lit streets of the city thinking about all the things he had learned and all the skills he had developed that nobody wanted him to use because they were too dangerous, or too destabilizing, or too likely to cause diplomatic incidents. Now none of that mattered because the Krell had given humanity permission to take off the gloves and fight the way humans fought best. Without rules and without mercy, and without any concern for what the rest of the galaxy thought about their methods. Dr. Angela Price stared at the bioscan results from the quarantined colony of New Boston and felt a strange mix of horror and professional admiration, because the Krell bioweapon was unlike anything she had ever seen in her 20 years of studying neural pathogens. The molecular structure was so elegant and so perfectly designed that she couldn't help but appreciate it, even as she knew that this thing was killing thousands of people who had done nothing wrong except live in the wrong place at the wrong time. Kevin Hall looked at her with concern because he had heard her mutter something about elegance, and he couldn't understand how anyone could use that word when people were literally tearing each other apart down on the surface of New Boston. Angela saw his expression and quickly explained that she wasn't admiring what the weapon did, but rather how it did it, because understanding the mechanism was the first step toward creating a counter-agent that could save the people who were still alive. The bioweapon worked by spreading through the amygdala, which was the part of the brain that controlled fear and aggression, and it heightened all the fight-or-flight responses while simultaneously suppressing the higher reasoning that made humans different from animals. The Krell must have used this weapon on dozens of other species over their long history, and it probably worked perfectly every single time, because most species didn't have the neural plasticity that humans had developed over millions of years of adaptation. Angela pulled up another screen and showed Kevin something that made him lean forward with interest, because about 8% of the infected population was showing resistance patterns that suggested their brains were actively fighting against the bioweapon's effects. It wasn't happening fast enough to save most of the colonists, but it proved that humans could adapt even to something this sophisticated, and that gave them a chance to create a treatment that would work on everyone. She told Kevin that she needed 48 hours and unlimited access to the research facility's resources, and he nodded and left to make sure she got everything she needed, because when Angela Price said she needed something, it wasn't a request, it was a requirement for saving lives. While Angela worked in her lab surrounded by screens and test tubes and equipment that hummed with the sound of science in progress, Admiral Marcus Kane was convening an emergency meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a secure conference room that was shielded against every form of electronic surveillance known to humanity. The holographic table in the center displayed the affected colonies in red, and the color spread across human space like blood seeping through water. General Linda Hayes was the head of the Marine Corps, and she had spent 30 years learning how to fight wars in every environment from frozen moons to underwater colonies, and she leaned forward with her hands flat on the table and said that they needed to mobilize immediately with full deployment, because if the Krell thought chaos was their weapon, they hadn't seen what happened when humanity had a clear enemy to focus all their anger and creativity on. Marcus agreed, but said they needed to be smart about their response because the Krell had been doing this for 3,000 years, and they would expect humanity to come charging in with guns blazing like angry children who didn't know any better. That meant they needed to do something unexpected, and something that would make the Krell question everything they thought they knew about how wars were fought. Director Frank Morrison spoke up from his position at the far end of the table, and his voice was quiet, but everyone listened because when Morrison spoke, it usually meant something classified and dangerous was about to be suggested. He said that humanity had kept certain projects under wraps for decades because the ethics committee always got nervous about weapons and tactics that seemed too brutal or too destabilizing. But maybe it was time to show the galaxy what happened when humanity decided that the gloves were coming off. Marcus looked at Morrison and asked if he was talking about Project Havoc, and Morrison smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and said that Havoc was just one of several programs that could be activated if the authorization came through. He had a list of volunteers who had been training for scenarios exactly like this one, and these were people who were comfortable operating in chaotic environments because they had been selected specifically for their ability to think outside the box and do things that regular soldiers couldn't or wouldn't do. The authorization came through within hours because when 17 colonies go dark and an alien species openly declares war on humanity, the usual bureaucratic delays tend to disappear like morning fog in sunlight. Sealed orders went out to classified facilities across Earth and its core colonies, and soldiers who had spent years training for asymmetric warfare were suddenly told that everything they had learned was about to be put to use in a real combat situation. Scientists who had been developing weapons that were deemed too destabilizing for conventional use received messages telling them to finalize their projects and prepare for immediate deployment. Intelligence operatives who specialized in psychological warfare and information manipulation were given targets and told to do whatever was necessary to destabilize the Krell command structure. The machine that was humanity's military-industrial complex shifted into a higher gear, and the sound it made wasn't the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery, but rather the quiet clicking of keys and the soft hum of computers as thousands of people began working on the problem of how to make the Krell regret ever hearing the word human. Captain Jake Sullivan arrived at a classified facility exactly 24 hours after receiving his orders and found himself in a briefing room with 49 other operators who had been pulled from various special forces units and intelligence agencies. Some of them he recognized from past operations and some were strangers, but they all had the same look in their eyes that said they were very good at things that most people preferred not to think about. Colonel Patricia Vance stood at the podium, and her expression was all business as she explained that they had been selected because they were the best at what they did, and what they did wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. The Krell thought they understood chaos because they had studied it and weaponized it, but they were about to learn the difference between academic knowledge and practical experience. She pulled up a star map that showed the Krell Dominion's territory and explained that the enemy operated from a network of staging bases throughout the Outer Rim that were protected by conventional forces, but whose real defense was psychological. The Krell used fear and confusion and misinformation to destabilize their enemies before moving in to occupy territory, and they had been doing this successfully for thousands of years. Jake spoke up and said that the obvious response was to do the same thing to them but better, and Patricia nodded and said that was exactly the plan, but with one crucial difference. Humans had spent their entire history fighting each other, and they had developed psychological warfare and asymmetric tactics to a degree that the Krell couldn't match, because the Krell had always been the dominant force and had never needed to learn how to fight from a position of weakness. Over the next week, human forces mobilized, but casual observers watching from other species' territories would have been confused because there were no massive fleet movements and no obvious buildup of forces near Krell space. Instead, smaller units began appearing throughout the Outer Rim, hitting targets and then disappearing before the Krell could respond, and each attack seemed random and disconnected from the others. But there was a pattern, and that pattern was designed to make the Krell question their own intelligence networks and wonder if maybe their bioweapon hadn't worked as well as they thought it had. Down on New Boston, Dr. Angela Price's counteragent was deployed via aerial distribution, and within 72 hours colonists began regaining their higher cognitive functions, and some of them wept at what they had done while infected, while others immediately asked how they could help fight back against the species that had done this to them. Jake's team infiltrated a Krell listening post on the edge of the Helios Nebula, and they didn't destroy it because destruction was easy, and any idiot with explosives could blow things up. Instead, they hacked into the post systems and began feeding false intelligence back to the Krell command structure, with reports of massive human fleet movements and civil wars breaking out on Earth and desperate peace overtures from human diplomats. All of it was lies, and all of it was designed to make the Krell think their plan was working perfectly, so they would let their guard down and make mistakes. The Krell High Command gathered in their citadel on Thresh Prime, feeling quite pleased with themselves because all the reports coming in suggested that their plan was working even better than they had hoped. Supreme Commander Vethrak sat on his elevated platform and reviewed the intelligence feeds with satisfaction, as his subordinates hissed their approval at the news of human colonies tearing themselves apart. He announced that the humans were crumbling exactly as predicted, and that their colonies were destroying themselves from within, which meant the Krell could move to occupy the territory within the next cycle, without losing a single warrior. One of his subordinates interrupted with a report about some irregularities in their own systems, but Vethrak dismissed it with a wave of his clawed hand, because chaos always spread in unpredictable directions, and these minor issues were probably just side effects of the humans' collapse affecting nearby installations. What Vethrak didn't know, and what he couldn't have known because his species had never experienced being on the receiving end of their own tactics, was that Captain Jake Sullivan's team wasn't working alone. Across Krell space, dozens of human special operations units were conducting what they called applied chaos theory, and it wasn't about destroying things because destruction was loud and obvious and easy to respond to. Instead, it was about undermining every system the Krell relied upon in ways so subtle that by the time they noticed something was wrong, it would be too late to fix it. Lieutenant Corey Barnes was an expert in cyber warfare who had spent 8 years learning how to break into systems that were supposed to be unbreakable, and he had infiltrated the Krell logistics network with an elegance that would have made Dr. Angela Price proud if she had known about it. With just a few lines of code that were hidden so well that even the best Krell security experts wouldn't find them for months, Corey ensured that ammunition shipments arrived at military bases without the firing pins that made the ammunition actually work. Food supplies were routed to empty stations where they would sit and rot while soldiers at active bases went hungry. Priority communications were delayed by just enough time to cause confusion without triggering the automated alerts that would tell the Krell something was wrong. Commander Holly Prince led a different kind of team that specialized in psychological operations, and her methods were even more subtle than Corey's because she didn't touch any military systems at all. Instead, she hijacked Krell entertainment, broadcasts and inserted messages that were so carefully crafted that the viewers wouldn't consciously notice them, but their subconscious minds would absorb the ideas like sponges soaking up water. The messages were designed to instill paranoia and make the Krell question things they had always taken for granted. Were their leaders telling them everything about the war with the humans, or were they hiding information to prevent panic? Could they trust their own intelligence reports, or had the humans somehow compromised their networks? What if the humans weren't collapsing at all, but were merely pretending to collapse as part of some elaborate strategy? Each individual message was too subtle to cause alarm, but the cumulative effect over days and weeks was devastating because the Krell, who were masters at inflicting psychological warfare on other species, had never experienced being on the receiving end. Their rigid hierarchical structure that was designed for efficiency in peacetime became a liability in war when the information flowing through it became unreliable because subordinates were afraid to report bad news and superiors were afraid to trust the reports they received. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the industrial machine that had built humanity's expansion into space shifted into an even higher gear than it had been running at before. Shipyards that had been producing civilian vessels for colonization and trade retooled their assembly lines for military production, and within weeks they were churning out warships at a rate that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. Research facilities that had been working on theoretical projects suddenly unveiled weapon systems that looked like they had come from science fiction, but were very real and very functional. Scientists who had been told that certain technologies were too dangerous to develop found themselves with unlimited budgets and authorization to create whatever they thought might give humanity an edge in the war. Admiral Marcus Kane stood in the command center on Earth and watched the strategic display that showed human forces moving into position across the entire theater of operations. The display looked chaotic to anyone who didn't understand the plan, but Marcus could see the pattern emerging like a picture forming from thousands of individual pixels. And he knew that the Krell were about to learn a very painful lesson. General Linda Hayes stood beside him and asked if they were ready for the final phase, and Marcus nodded, because Dr. Price had reported that all the affected colonies were now clear of the Krell bioweapon. The counter-agent had worked even better than expected, and the colonists who had survived were being treated for trauma. But they were alive and they were angry, and many of them had volunteered to join the military effort. Director Frank Morrison sent a message confirming that the Krell command structure was starting to show stress fractures, as the accumulated effects of weeks of subtle sabotage and psychological warfare began to overwhelm their ability to respond effectively. Supply chains were breaking down and communications were unreliable, and soldiers in the field were starting to question whether their orders made sense, or if maybe someone had made a mistake somewhere up the chain of command. Marcus allowed himself a thin smile as he gave the order to proceed with the final phase, because the time for subtlety was over, and now it was time to show the Krell what came after chaos. Order, and brutal, efficient human order that was backed by the full industrial might of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning how to fight wars. Jake Sullivan's team received their new orders while they were still at the compromised Krell listening post, and Jake read them twice to make sure he understood correctly, because the orders were telling them to stop hiding and start making noise. The subtle phase was over, and now humanity wanted the Krell to know exactly who was destroying their empire and why. He gathered his team and told them that they had done good work over the past few weeks, but now it was time to shift tactics, because the main fleet was about to arrive at Thresh Prime, and they needed every Krell ship and soldier tied up dealing with local crises instead of being able to reinforce the homeworld. That meant it was time to stop being ghosts and start being hurricanes that swept through Krell space, destroying everything that wasn't nailed down and setting fire to everything that was. Lieutenant Corey Barnes uploaded a virus into the Krell logistics network that was no longer subtle at all, and within hours every supply depot in 3 sectors received orders to destroy their contents immediately because of supposed contamination. Automated systems followed the orders without question, and by the time Krell officers realized what was happening, billions of credits worth of supplies had been incinerated. Commander Holly Prince's psychological operations team stopped inserting subtle messages into broadcasts and instead hijacked the main Krell news network to show footage of human forces destroying Krell installations across the Outer Rim. The footage was real and it was devastating, and it showed Krell warriors fleeing from human soldiers who moved with a precision and efficiency that made it clear this wasn't a desperate last stand by a dying species, but rather a calculated military operation by a power that knew exactly what it was doing. Across Krell space, the carefully maintained image of invincibility that had kept subject species in line for 3,000 years began to crack like ice under pressure. Subject species watched the broadcasts and saw the Krell retreating, and they began to wonder if maybe this was their chance to rebel and throw off the chains that had bound them for generations. The Krell High Command tried to contain the situation, but every action they took seemed to make things worse because they were fighting an enemy that understood how to use their own systems and psychology against them. Vethrak finally realized that the irregularities his subordinate had reported weeks ago weren't minor side effects, but rather the first signs of a systematic campaign to destroy the Dominion from within. He ordered a full security review of all systems, but by then it was too late, because the humans had been inside their networks for so long that they had left backdoors and hidden programs throughout the entire infrastructure. Even if the Krell found and removed every single piece of malicious code, it would take months or years to be sure their systems were clean, and they didn't have months or years because the human fleet had just appeared on the edge of their home system. Supreme Commander Vethrak stared at the tactical display showing the human fleet dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the Thresh Prime system, and felt something his species rarely experienced, which was genuine fear, because there weren't just a few ships or even a few dozen ships, but rather hundreds of warships arranged in a formation that spoke of careful planning and overwhelming force. He had spent his entire career studying military history, and he recognized what he was seeing as the opening move of a campaign designed not just to defeat an enemy, but to completely destroy their ability to ever threaten anyone again. His communications officer was frantically trying to get reports from the outer system defenses, but the responses were confused and contradictory, because some stations reported that their weapons were offline, while others said they were receiving conflicting orders, and still others had simply gone silent without explanation. Vethrak realized with a sick certainty that the humans had been inside their systems far longer than anyone had suspected, and that every piece of intelligence they had received about the human collapse had been carefully manufactured lies. He demanded to know how this was possible, and his intelligence officer trembled as he explained that the humans had apparently been infiltrating Krell networks for weeks, using techniques that were so sophisticated that even now they weren't sure how deep the compromise went. Everything the Krell had believed about the humans' military capabilities and everything they had been told about the success of the bioweapon had been part of an elaborate deception designed to make the Krell overconfident and unprepared. The view screen suddenly flickered and changed to show a human face that belonged to Admiral Marcus Kane, and Vethrak found himself looking into eyes that held no anger or hatred, but rather a cold professional contempt that was somehow worse than any emotional response would have been. Marcus spoke in a measured tone that made it clear he wasn't trying to intimidate or threaten, but rather simply stating facts that the Krell needed to understand. He explained that the Krell had made a critical error in their assessment of humanity, because they had assumed that just because humans disliked chaos, they didn't understand it or know how to use it. The truth was exactly the opposite, because humanity had spent its entire history managing chaos and adapting to it and learning how to turn it into a weapon. While the Krell studied chaos from a comfortable distance, humans had been born into it and molded by it, and they had become very, very good at weaponizing it against their enemies. Marcus gestured, and the view pulled back to show the full scope of the human fleet arranged around Thresh Prime. And Vethrak felt his stomach drop, because this wasn't a punitive expedition or a retaliatory strike, but rather a full military deployment that represented the complete mobilization of human military power. The ships were arranged in attack formations and their weapons were powered up, and it was clear that the humans had come not to negotiate or to make demands, but to end the Krell dominion as a threat once and for all. The Admiral continued speaking, and said that the Krell had wanted to see what happened when humanity faced chaos, and now they were going to see what happened when humanity decided to stop being patient and diplomatic and restrained. They had finally been given a reason to get serious and show the galaxy what they were really capable of when someone pushed them too far. The battle for Thresh Prime lasted 6 hours, but calling it a battle was generous, because battles implied some degree of equal contest between opposing forces, and what happened around the Krell homeworld was more like a systematic dismantling of defenses that had already been weakened by weeks of sabotage. The Krell defenders tried to mount a resistance, but their weapon systems malfunctioned at critical moments, and their communications were jammed or redirected, and their supply lines had been cut days earlier without anyone realizing it. Human forces moved through the Krell defenses like a surgical blade cutting through diseased tissue, and they demonstrated tactics and weapon systems that made it clear they had been developing their military capabilities in secret while projecting an image of peaceful expansion. The Krell had mistaken humanity's preference for diplomacy as weakness, and that mistake was now costing them everything they had built over 3,000 years. Captain Jake Sullivan's team was part of the ground assault that hit the central citadel, and they moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency that came from years of training for exactly this kind of operation. They encountered resistance from Krell security forces, but the defenders were already demoralized by weeks of psychological warfare, and by the obvious fact that their supposedly impregnable fortress was falling to an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. Jake's squad reached the command center with minimal casualties, and they found Supreme Commander Vethrak standing alone at his tactical display, watching reports of Krell forces surrendering across the sector. The reptilian commander turned to face them, and his 4 eyes held a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been respect, because even in defeat he could recognize that he had been outplayed by an enemy he should have taken more seriously. Vethrak said that humans were supposed to destroy themselves under the influence of the Chaos bioweapon, and that the Krell had used that same weapon successfully on dozens of other species. Jake checked his weapon, and then looked at the alien commander with something that wasn't quite pity but wasn't triumph either, because he understood that the Krell had simply made the mistake of thinking they understood humanity based on surface observations. He explained that humans didn't just survive chaos, but rather they weaponized it and systematized it and turned it into a tool that could be used with surgical precision. The Krell had given humanity exactly what it needed, which was a legitimate reason to stop pretending they weren't extremely good at warfare, and to demonstrate the full capabilities they had been keeping hidden during decades of peaceful expansion. Within a month, the Krell Dominion collapsed, not because humanity destroyed it with overwhelming military force, although they certainly could have, but rather because humanity had dismantled it piece by piece, using the Krell's own tactics against them, with an efficiency that bordered on surgical. Subject species that had been held under Krell control for centuries rose up in rebellion, and human forces provided support and weapons and training, but mostly they just needed to step back and let the accumulated resentment of generations do the work. The galaxy watched nervously as humanity emerged from the conflict as a new major power in the Outer Rim, and species that had previously dismissed humans as naive newcomers suddenly found themselves reevaluating their assumptions. The humans had been careful and diplomatic and measured in their expansion, but the war with the Krell had revealed that underneath that peaceful exterior was a species that was very good at violence when circumstances required it. Admiral Marcus Kane addressed the United Earth Assembly in a speech that was broadcast across human space and monitored by intelligence services from dozens of other species. He spoke carefully and chose his words with precision because he knew that this speech would define how humanity was perceived for generations to come. He said that humanity had not sought conflict with the Krell and had not wanted to reveal this aspect of their nature to the galaxy, but the Krell had forced their hand by attacking innocent colonies and using a bioweapon that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The Krell had given humanity something they had quietly hoped they would never need, which was a legitimate justification for demonstrating what happened when humanity decided to stop holding back. Marcus paused and looked directly at the camera, knowing that he was speaking not just to humans but to every species in the galaxy that might be watching this broadcast. He said that humanity preferred peace and advocated for diplomatic solutions and would always choose negotiation over combat when possible. But if someone brought chaos to their door, they would discover that humans had thousands of years of practice, turning chaos into something far more dangerous, which was unified purpose backed by industrial might and military capability. The message was clear, and it was delivered without threats or bluster, but rather with the calm certainty of someone stating observable facts. Humanity had shown what they could do when properly motivated, and now every species in the galaxy would have to factor that capability into their calculations when dealing with human interests. Down on Earth, Dr. Angela Price watched the speech from her laboratory where she was already working on medical treatments to help the colonists who had been affected by the Krell bioweapon recover from the psychological trauma. Kevin Hall stood beside her and asked if she thought humanity had gone too far in their response to the Krell attack. Angela considered Kevin's question while looking at the data showing recovery rates from the colonies that had been hit by the Krell bioweapon, and she saw families that had been reunited and communities that were beginning to heal from the trauma of what they had experienced. She thought about the people who would have died if humanity hadn't responded decisively, and she thought about the message that weakness would have sent to other aggressive species in the galaxy who might have seen humans as easy targets. She said no with certainty because the Krell had released their bioweapon expecting humanity to crumble and turn on itself. But instead they had given humans exactly what they needed, which was unity of purpose and a clear enemy to focus all their considerable talents on. The Krell had wanted to teach humanity a lesson about chaos, but instead they had learned a much more painful lesson about consequences and about what happened when you underestimated a species based on superficial observations. Kevin nodded and went back to his work while Angela pulled up the latest reports from the reconstruction efforts across the affected colonies. The physical damage had been minimal because the Krell bioweapon didn't destroy infrastructure, but the psychological damage was going to take years to fully heal. Still, the colonists were showing remarkable resilience, and many of them had channeled their trauma into determination to help rebuild and to ensure that nothing like this ever happened to another human colony. In orbit around Thresh Prime, Captain Jake Sullivan stood on the observation deck of a human warship and looked down at the Krell homeworld below. The planet was intact because humanity had no interest in genocide or unnecessary destruction, but the Krell military infrastructure had been systematically dismantled, and new governments were forming in the regions that had been held under Dominion control. His team was being rotated back to Earth for rest and debriefing, but Jake knew that none of them would truly rest, because once you had seen combat, and once you had been part of an operation, this successful, there was always a part of your mind that stayed alert and ready. He thought about his retirement in New Tokyo and his quiet life in that bar, and he realized that he had been slowly dying of boredom before the war gave him a reason to be useful again. Lieutenant Corey Barnes joined him at the observation window and said that the Cyber Warfare Division was already analyzing everything they had learned from infiltrating Krell systems because the techniques they had developed would be invaluable if humanity ever faced another threat. He seemed almost excited about the prospect, and Jake smiled, because that was exactly the kind of thinking that had made humanity successful in this war. They didn't just fight wars and then forget about them, but rather they studied every engagement and learned from every success and failure and incorporated those lessons into their training and doctrine. Other species might fight the same way for thousands of years, but humans were constantly evolving their tactics because adaptation was built into their nature at a fundamental level. Commander Holly Prince was already working with the intelligence services to help establish stable governments in former Krell territories, and her psychological operations expertise was being used to ease the transition from authoritarian control to self-governance. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary because humanity understood that winning a war was only the first step, and that the real challenge was building a lasting peace that prevented future conflicts. Back on Earth, the massive industrial mobilization that had produced the ships and weapons for the war was being carefully scaled back, but not eliminated because the lesson of the Krell attack was clear. Humanity needed to maintain the capability to respond quickly to threats even during times of peace, and that meant keeping research facilities active and maintaining a significant military presence across their territory. Director Frank Morrison was already meeting with the Ethics Committee to discuss which of the classified projects could be safely continued and which needed to be locked away again because the immediate crisis had passed. It was a delicate balance between maintaining readiness and avoiding the militarization of society, but Morrison was confident they could find that balance because humans had always been good at walking difficult lines. Admiral Marcus Kane received reports from across human space about the impact of the war on public opinion, and he was pleased to see that most people understood the necessity of the response, even if some were uncomfortable with how effective humanity had been at warfare. There would always be debates about military spending and ethical concerns about certain weapon systems, but the fundamental question of whether humanity could defend itself had been answered definitively. The other species in the galaxy were adjusting to the new reality of human military capability, and diplomatic channels were buzzing with requests for meetings and proposals for alliances. Some species that had previously been dismissive of humanity now wanted to establish closer relationships, while others who had been friendly were nervous about having such a powerful neighbor. Marcus knew that the next few years would be critical in establishing humanity's role in galactic politics because they had proven they could fight, but now they needed to prove they could be trusted with the power they had demonstrated. That meant being careful about how they used their military forces, and being generous in helping rebuild the regions devastated by the war, and being patient with species that were still adjusting to the new balance of power. Dr. Angela Price published her research on the Krell bioweapon and the counter-agent she had developed, and the scientific community was amazed by both the sophistication of the weapon and the speed with which humanity had responded to it. Other species began requesting access to the counter-agent because the Krell had apparently used similar bioweapons on numerous species over the centuries, and there were populations that still suffered from long-term effects. Angela was happy to share her research because she believed that scientific knowledge should be used to help people, regardless of their species, and because building good relationships with the galactic medical community would benefit humanity in the long run. She received numerous awards and speaking invitations, but what mattered most to her was knowing that her work had saved lives and would continue to save lives for years to come. In bars and rec rooms across human space, soldiers who had participated in the war raised their glasses in toasts that echoed Captain Jake Sullivan's first reaction to receiving his deployment orders. they said finally with genuine feeling because many of them had spent years training for combat that never came, and dealing with the frustration of being prepared for threats that never materialized. The war with the Krell had given them a chance to prove their worth and to demonstrate that all those years of training and preparation had not been wasted. There was no glory in the violence itself because professionals understood that war was terrible, even when necessary. But there was satisfaction in knowing they had protected their people and defended their homes and shown the galaxy that humanity was not to be trifled with. They had been given a reason to get serious, and they had responded with everything they had, and the results spoke for themselves. The Krell survivors were being helped to establish new governments and rebuild their society, without the aggressive expansionism that had defined the Dominion for so long. Some of them were bitter about their defeat, but others seemed almost relieved that the burden of maintaining an empire had been lifted from their shoulders. Humanity was careful not to become occupiers or colonizers, but rather to help facilitate the transition to peaceful coexistence. In the United Earth Assembly, debates raged about what the war meant for humanity's future, and what kind of civilization they wanted to build now that they had proven their military capabilities. Some argued for aggressive expansion to secure resources and territory, while others advocated for a return to the diplomatic approach that had characterized pre-war human policy. The compromise that emerged was a doctrine of strength through readiness, which meant maintaining significant military forces and continuing to develop new technologies while using diplomatic means as the primary tool for resolving conflicts. Humanity would be strong enough to defend itself and its allies, but would not seek to build an empire or dominate other species through force. Admiral Marcus Kane retired 6 months after the end of the war and wrote a book about the conflict that became required reading at military academies across human space. He emphasized the importance of understanding your enemy and of being willing to adapt tactics to meet changing circumstances, and of never underestimating an opponent based on superficial observations. His final chapter was titled, A Reason to Get Serious, and it discussed how the Krell attack had unified humanity in a way that decades of peacetime politics had failed to achieve. Captain Jake Sullivan did not return to his quiet retirement in New Tokyo, but instead accepted a position training the next generation of special operations soldiers. He found that he enjoyed teaching, and that his experiences during the war gave him insights that would help keep future soldiers alive when they faced their own challenges. He often told his students that the best warrior was one who never had to fight, but who was ready to do so when necessary.